Today, our first speaker is Professor Brandon Look, who is a professor at the University of Kentucky. I'll tell you a little about him. He received his PhD from the University of Chicago. He mainly works in history of early modern philosophy, but not just early. He works in metaphysics. He works in history and philosophy of science. And Spinoza, Leibniz, Kant. He has written 3 books, written or edited 3 books on Leibniz. And he is working these days on the connection between Leibniz and Kant. And it seems his interests are metaphysical, substance, causation, modality, these kinds of things. He's one of the people I look up to in Leibniz scholarship, and very interested to hear how much broader his interests are. And today, as you will see, he will talk about causal theories among the Continental Rationalists. Professor Look.
Thank you, Stephen. Thank you for the nice introduction. Before I begin, I want to thank Lizzie for the invitation to come speak. It's been a treat to be here. It's been tiring also to be here, but it's been in a good way, in a very good way. I really thank you for your hospitality. It's been wonderful. Nazif asked me to speak on causal theories among the Continental Rationalists. And he said that I should give a survey of causal theories in this period, in the 17th century. That's what I intend to do. My fear is perhaps that this will be somewhat superficial for some of you, but in preparing this talk, actually I learned a few new things, or was reminded of a few things that I had forgotten, so I hope there will be something for even the specialists in early modern philosophy, just as there was something new and novel for me. Before I begin, though, I want to say something about the title, actually. I'm following Nazif's lead, but I'm actually a person, a scholar, who doesn't really like the terms rationalism and empiricism. I think that they lead us to see too many similarities among people who are dissimilar, and lead us to not see similarities between people who are often grouped in different camps. Which is why, I mean, Nazif will certainly talk about this when he gets to talk about Hume, but there are many ways in which, of course, Hume drew on themes from Malebranche in important ways that one often doesn't realize. There are important ways, of course, in which people often called rationalists are arguing with each other. So what does it even mean to talk about rationalism? That's what I want to talk about first. I think we've got this kind of thematic overview of this talk. I mean, what does rationalism have to do with occasionalism anyhow? What does rationalism have to do with causal theories in general? Or even, what does rationalism mean? So just on the basic level, if you were to ask, what does a rationalist believe? A rationalist believes that there are innate ideas. Okay, that's probably the simplest and easiest answer. And is a commitment to innate ideas relevant for this discussion of causal relations? Not so much. Is it relevant to a discussion of occasionalism? Not so much, except perhaps insofar as Descartes and Leibniz and Malebranche and these other people believe that we can have knowledge of the nature of God, and that knowledge is dependent upon certain innate ideas. But otherwise, it doesn't really play much of a role. The second way in which, or the second meaning of rationalism is important. That is, rationalists are committed in some sense to the principle of sufficient reason. Okay? And I'll talk more about that later, but basically the idea is, of course, that for everything there is a reason why it exists. Right, and why it is so and not otherwise. Now, that doesn't obviously lead you to occasionalism in no way, or at least not necessarily so. But it does play a role in discussions of causal theories. Okay? I think actually, as I said, I don't really like the distinction between rationalism and empiricism. I think one reason that I don't like it is that it fits too easily into a discussion of the history of philosophy that we get from Kant and from post-Kantian philosophers, where Kant is seen as someone who reconciles rationalism and empiricism. And I think that that's too simplistic a picture. Rationalism is also not the term that any of the figures on the ground would have used to describe themselves. In fact, not even Kant really calls those figures rationalists. Most of those figures will be called dogmatic metaphysicians. Okay? I think a better thing to do is to ask, what is it or how is it that these historical figures describe themselves? And most of them consider themselves as moderns. They were novatores. They were the new kids on the block, right? They were developing a new way of doing philosophy. So if you think of characteristics of modern philosophy, which might be a better way of doing this, one of the most important things is there was the rejection of the Aristotelian conception of causation. And that, of course, is going to be the most important thing for this discussion this morning. So they rejected Aristotelian causation, the good old material, formal, final, and efficient causation, and instead claimed that everything had to be explained in terms of efficient causation. And this, of course, led to a mechanistic account of the world. The second thing, which goes along with this in a way, is although they rejected this classical Aristotelian or scholastic conception of causation, most of these characters, most of the characters that I'm going to talk about, were theists. And so they had to reconcile in some way theism with mechanism and a naturalistic account of the world. Okay? And that's going to play, again, as I said, part of the role here. Now, the second part of the thematic overview. I thought I had this set up. Anyway, so there are two particular problems for causal theories in the 17th century. Problems that, as I'll show, or as I'll say, were inherited in a way from Descartes. First of all, we have to explain the way in which bodies interact, so body-body causation, purely in terms of mechanism. And we have to explain the mind-body relation, or mind-body causation, how the body can affect the mind, how things out there can produce ideas in me, and how volitions in me can produce things out there in the world. Just another thing to throw out there, although I guess we've already discussed this, but just to have it in the back of our minds. The two central theses of occasionalism, which we'll find, are first, that no finite being is causally efficacious, and that God is the sole efficient cause. Okay? So, with that kind of thematic background, let me just talk briefly about the figures I'm going to discuss this morning. Naturally, Descartes, because as I said, he created many of these problems for 17th century figures, or he created the background in which most of thought about causation would be conducted. And these figures are arranged here chronologically by birth date. I'm going to present their philosophies in a slightly different order that corresponds better to a certain kind of narrative I want to tell. But in any case, as I said, all of these figures consider themselves moderns, but for most of the story that I want to tell, they're all reacting strongly against Descartes, or with Descartes, expanding upon Descartes' philosophy, and so on. So, other figures of the 17th century that I'm not going to be talking about are people like Bacon, or Hobbes, or Gassendi, people in this tradition. Well, Bacon and Hobbes are in one tradition, Gassendi is another. They are less Cartesians, anti-Cartesians in the first sense. So Descartes, as you know, author of the Meditations of the First Philosophy, 1641, Principles of Philosophy, 1644, Passions of the Soul, read best in Stephen's wonderful translation. Next up, chronologically, is Causality. Okay, I put the titles of these works in English when there's a standard English translation, left them in the original language when there's not. So Causal's main work that we use is the distinction of the body and the soul, le discernement du corps et de l'âme. Next, a figure that I think Chrissy mentioned, someone who awakened her interest in occasionalism, Gödeling's. I didn't know this until recently that the Irish author Samuel Beckett claims to have some fascination with Gödeling's. Who would have known that? But there you go. He has two main works that will be of relevance to us, a couple more actually, but the Questiones Politicae, so various questions, and the True Metaphysics. The True Metaphysics comes later, although some of the things that he thought and arrived at came earlier. Louis de Lafforgue, whose main work is the Traité de l'Esprit de l'Homme. Spinoza, of course, ethics, who, of course, is not an occasionalist, and Malebranche, of course, who is the most famous occasionalist, with the work Search After Truth, the Treatise on Nature and Grace, and Dialogues on Metaphysics and Religion, spanning from 1674 to 1688. And, of course, he wrote into the early 18th century as well. I put Simon Fouché on here originally, since he has a very famous critique of Malebranche, but I'm not going to talk about him, but just so you know that there was a figure who came up who right away saw the Search After Truth and right away said, no, this is totally bonkers, this is wrong. And then, of course, Leibniz, who will come last in the story, who I think gives an important and interesting account of causation that it's not occasionalist, is in the Cartesian tradition, but also, in an important way, harkens back to Platonic traditions and medieval traditions. Okay. So, here's a kind of standard story of the problems of causation. The two problems, that is body-body causation and mind-body causation, we get from Cartesian metaphysics and his natural philosophy. More specifically, from Cartesian dualism and from his account of body. That is, if we think of Cartesian dualism, it's a thesis that there are two sorts of beings in the world, minds and bodies. The essence of mind is thought, and the essence of body is extension. So two radically different kinds of things. Now, some may also know that there are places in the Passions of the Soul, other works where Descartes suggests that, well, there are two kinds of things, bodies and minds, but then a human being is kind of a separate thing, it's a special kind of thing, it kind of is a union of these two things. So maybe there are three kinds of things in the world, but ultimately, the problem that we get, or that the 17th century philosophers got, was that there are two different, radically different kinds of things. Okay? And this is going to be a doctrine or a view of the world that's going to be accepted by most of these figures that we'll talk about, Causality, Lafforgue, Malebranche, and others. The second problem, the mind-body problem, famously, is, of course, related to dualism. How could it not be? How can a mind, something that consists in thought and not extension, interact and form a union with a body, something that consists in extension and not thought? Or put differently, how do you explain the causal interaction between two things of fundamentally different natures? And then the problem of body-body causation, which we get from Descartes simply by virtue of this account of body, right? How do you explain the interaction of bodies when they're conceived of as merely extended beings? As Dan Garber usually puts it, they are geometrical objects made concrete. Okay, they're just objects extended in space. They have, in and of themselves, perhaps no forces, which would be one of Leibniz's criticisms, and so on. So I'm explaining how those things, just by virtue of extension, can interact. Okay? That's the standard story. Now, we can get a little more complex, and this is going to pick up in one way issues that Jeff was talking about yesterday with respect to Suarez and the doctrine of continuous creation and conservation and so on. If you look at the two axioms, or if you look at the axioms for the existence that are used in the argument for the existence of God in the Meditations and the Principles of Philosophy, you find two axioms that relate to causation. And I should actually say one thing as an aside. You know, as preparing for this, I wanted to find a place, and I thought I remembered it, but then I couldn't find it, so I was obviously remembering it incorrectly, or probably was remembering it incorrectly. I thought there was a place where Descartes says, by cause I mean blah, 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 blah. And in fact, I couldn't find that. And so it led me to think that many of these figures are actually using or appealing to causation without ever giving a simple definition of cause. By cause, I mean this, that, or the other thing. Some of the figures we'll talk about later, Gödelings and Balbosch, do this famously in really interesting ways. But Descartes doesn't, Laforge doesn't, Cournois doesn't. Even Leibniz doesn't have a good definition, which is surprising given that it defines just about everything. But in any case, if you look at the arguments for the existence of God and the Meditations and the Principles of Philosophy, you get two kinds of axioms presented. The first is the same power and action are needed to preserve something as would be needed to create something new. And that's part of the reason why Descartes knows, well, that power can't come from me. I know that I can't keep myself in existence. Therefore, that thing has to come, that power has to come from something else. It's God. And the second thing, which actually won't play much of a role, it is an interesting thesis about causation in and of itself, which is why I wanted to remind you of it. They claim that there must be at least as much reality in the cause as in the effect. And this relates to his ontological argument for the existence of God. Now, the former, of course, this is obvious from what Jeff talked about yesterday, the former relates to the doctrine of conservation as continuous recreation or continuous creation. And it's going to play an enormous role in Descartes' natural philosophy, in his physics, if you will. He says in the Principles, the nature of time is such that its parts are not mutually dependent and never coexist. Thus, from the fact that we now exist, it does not follow that we shall exist a moment from now, unless there is some cause, the same cause which originally produced us, which continually reproduces us, as it were, that is to say, which keeps us in existence. All right? So again, this is part of the argument for the existence of God as it's found in the Principles of Philosophy. We'll see a correlate to this in the natural philosophy in a moment. But notice here a couple of things. Jeff highlighted yesterday the difference between continuous creation and continuous recreation. All right? It seems here that Descartes is saying that we are continually reproduced by God. Everything in the world is continually reproduced. That in itself is interesting. Another thing that's interesting, and which plays some role in discussions of causation, and which I think is often lost on people, is simply the notion of time, right? So the nature of time is such that its parts are not mutually dependent. There's some debate in the literature about Descartes about his so-called atomistic conception of time. Right? Time seems to be composed of discrete units. And if you want to just bracket that or flag it in your minds for what Nazif will talk about when he talks about Hume, I assume Nazif will mention this, for Hume, all you perceive is one thing and then another, right? There are, as it were, atomistic moments of perception. You never see some kind of flowing of causal powers or anything like that. You never see a throughness of causation. Again, there's something like an atomistic account there. in both Descartes and in Hume. Okay, now the more interesting thing, I think, comes in Descartes' account of the laws of motion and the rules of impact. Actually, I won't really talk about the rules of impact, but the laws of motion, certainly. Descartes says in the second part of the Principles, section 36, that God is the primary cause of motion, and he always preserves the same quantity of motion in the universe. Okay? Now he distinguishes between primary the primary and universal cause of motion, that is God, and the particular causes. And this is also where I think it gets very interesting for Descartes, and I don't see this reproduced, or what's interesting here, I don't see really reproduced in the figures who follow him directly. Well, I'll mention that in a moment. But what does he say here? Why is God the primary cause? God created all the matter of the world and its motion and rest, and God's continuous creation preserves the same amount of motion. How does he argue for this? First of all, he says God created all the matter of the world and its motion and rest. That's kind of his definition of God. More important, though, God's perfection involves not only his being immutable in himself, but also his operating in a manner that is always utterly constant and immutable. This actually gets to the question that I asked 2 days ago about the immutability of God. Okay? God can't change, right? God creates everything, and as we see in the next premise, there's no distinction between the act of creation and the act of preservation. So God creates everything, there's no distinction between the act of creation and the act of preservation. God is immutable, right? So God preserves all matter in motion and rest by the same process by which he originally created it, and therefore it is most reasonable to assume, or most reasonable to think, Descartes says, that God preserves the same quantity of motion and rest, or motion, quantity of motion in matter. Okay? So we get this argument for conservation of motion, actually conservation of everything in the universe, by virtue of the immutability of God, and by the doctrine of the continuous creation or recreation of the world as God's preservation of the world. This part will actually be made more explicit by Malebranche in an interesting way. But here's what I wanted to get at a moment ago. Descartes makes this distinction between primary and secondary causes. And after what we just said, he will call the particular causes of motion the laws of motion. Right? So it's not as though God is the primary cause of motion and all the bodies in the world are the secondary causes of motion. Right? It's the laws. From God's immutability, we can also know certain laws or laws of nature, which are the secondary or particular causes of the various motions we see in particular bodies. Right? Now, I won't go through this, but the three laws that he's referring to relate to the inertia of bodies, relates to the rectilinear motion of bodies, and then the third one is very confusing. It relates to, it's the first part of this account of collision and impact of bodies, which is just a complete disaster. But the first two things make sense, right? God continues things, God preserves things in their state, so there's got to be kind of inertia, and he preserves them in their state, so there must be rectilinear motion. But this is nevertheless odd, right? It seems like the laws are causes, not particular bodies. Okay? Or put differently, the primary cause is an agent, namely God. The secondary causes are, you might think of it as descriptions of regularities, not true agents at all. Right? So it's not as though a particular body is even a secondary cause. Okay? And that then raises the important question, which will lead us to occasionalism in one way, in his followers. Namely, it seems as though nothing other than God can count as a causal agent at all. Right? Now, we see this with Continental, right? I mentioned Continental and Laforge. main works came out in the same year, a few months apart. I think Cordemois' book came out a few months before Laforge's, but Laforge had claimed that he came up with the doctrine of occasionalism 8 years earlier, something like that. I really don't care. So we'll just talk about one and then the other. Now, Cordemois has a very interesting account of body-body causation in the Discernement. The fourth discourse is entitled on the first cause of body in motion, first cause of movement, sorry. And there he presents 5 axioms, which are in themselves pretty interesting. These are rough translations. In fact, the first translation is so rough that I had to rephrase it in kind of analytic terms. But he says something like, one does not have in itself, de soi, what one can lose without ceasing to be what one is. That's kind of what it says in French. But the better way to think of it is, if some substance can lose its property P and remain in existence, then that substance doesn't have a property per se. Okay? Second axiom. Every body could lose its motion as soon as it does not have it anymore without ceasing to be a body. So a body can stop moving and it'll still be a body. Well, of course. Here's where it gets more interesting though. One can only conceive two kinds, well actually no, this is, I'm sorry, we'll become interesting in a moment. This is standard Descartes. One can only conceive two kinds of substances, namely the mind and the body. That is why one ought to consider them as the causes of everything that can happen, and what cannot come from the one must necessarily be attributed to the other. Okay, a little bit is important. To move is an action, and an action can only be continued by the agent that originated it. And this is what I wanted to highlight a second ago. Cordemois presents this as an axiom, presumably something that's obvious. But I don't know about you, that does not strike me as obvious, as obviously true. Okay? But that's Cordemois. Now, he draws certain conclusions from this, which are very important to the story that we want to tell, I want to tell. The first is no body has movement in itself. Okay? The second, the first mover of bodies is not a body. Okay? His proof is the following. If the first mover of bodies were a body, it would follow that a body had movement per se. But by axiom 1, no body has motion per se. Therefore, blah, 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 it can't be a body. Right? It's easy to see here something like a Thomistic account of, this good old 5 ways for proving the existence of God, right? But the first mover of bodies is not a body, okay? It can only be a mind that was the first mover, okay? Because there are only 2 kinds of things, bodies or minds. If the first mover isn't a body, well, then it's got to be a mind, right? And then following that, it can only be the same mind that originated the motion of bodies that continues or preserves their motion. So again, it's God who's preserving all motion of all bodies at all times. Right? That's Cordemois on body-body causation. And it's easy to see that we've got our occasionalism here. The only causally efficacious being in the world is God, and no finite creature, or at least with respect to bodies, the realm of nature, no finite extended being can be causally efficacious. The following discourse in the Discernement considers the relation of mind and body. And this is just really quickly laid out. The argument is as follows. One thing can act on another if and only if it has the power to change its nature or essential property. So, in theory, a body could act on a body if it could change the motion or extension or shape of another body. Similarly, a mind can act on a mind if and only if it can change or create the thoughts in the mind. Right? So it has to have the same nature in order to be causally efficacious. Right? Minds can be causally efficacious in the realm of thought, bodies can be causally efficacious in the realm of extension and motion, what I just said. But now the crucial thing, but minds cannot affect changes in extended beings, and extended beings cannot affect ideas. And therefore, one must go outside of, Continental says, one must go outside of the union of mind and body to explain their union and interaction, which is just to say that God does it, right? There's no way to explain how my sensation of this thing outside of my mind can produce an idea in me, because the extended thing has a completely different nature from my mind. And in a similar way, it's completely impossible to explain how my volition to raise the bottle can produce something outside the world, outside my mind, outside my mind, right? Because my ideas and extended substance are of different natures. And yet we know, don't we, Continental says, that the mind and the body form a union. The only way to explain, and that they interact, well, interact, in the loose sense. The only way to explain that is then to seek the causal agent outside of that union. And the only thing that's going to be able to do that job is God. Right? That's the argument. And again, that's how we get an occasionalist thesis in Continental. All right, let's move on to Laforge. Laforge's argument for occasionalism, well, let me put it this way. Continental's argument for occasionalism seemed to follow most closely or most obviously from the Cartesian account of the nature of mind and body, right? Continental's, or Laforge's account of occasionalism, or what the main argument for occasionalism would be, seems to follow most obviously from Descartes' account, what we know as an older history, from the account of continuous creation. Okay? So what Laforge says is it was necessary for God to employ his omnipotent power in order to bring all of nature out of nothing. It would all return to nothing if God ceased bringing it out of nothing at each moment that he conserves it. Okay? Quote 1, so to speak. Quote 2, not only must God continue to produce it, any kind of body, if he wants to preserve it in existence, but, and this is one thing that's very interesting, in addition, because he cannot create it everywhere nor outside of any particular place, he must himself put it in place B or some particular place, if he wants it to be there. Now, the important thing to see here is that God is not only the creator and conserver of the world in abstracto, in some abstract way of just keeping everything going. God is causally responsible for the existence of every particular thing at every particular location, and also at every particular time, right? Another way of putting that is that God is responsible for the modal properties of all individual finite beings. God is responsible for this water bottle being here, right? He's responsible for this thing being here now and it's falling down now, right? He's responsible for its particular properties, for its being in one place now, in another place at another time, all right? Now, so the conclusion is obvious. Bodies are causally inert. God preserves all bodies at all times in particular places and times with particular properties, as I said. And this is something that isn't emphasized by Continental, but it's very much present in Laforge. It's a consequence of divine will. Okay? Now, there's a particular problem for Laforge, which is, what about the union of mind and body? What about perception and volition? What about the origin of ideas? Now, Laforge distinguishes two kinds of causes of ideas of bodies. There's the principal and efficient cause, And there's the remote, éloigné, and occasional cause. He will say that in the case of sense perception, the mind itself is the efficient cause. External objects or bodies are the occasional causes. Now, this is in itself kind of interesting. So, I perceive the bottle here. The bottle is, by virtue of its effect on my sensory apparatus, in some sense, no pun intended, the occasional cause, the remote cause of my idea of the bottle. But my mind is itself the cause of this bottle. In looking, from this little bottle to this little bottle, there's a transition in my ideas from this perception to this perception. And in a sense, the mind itself is a cause. That seems odd, but it's even stranger if you think that by Laforgue's argument for divine conservation, it would seem that minds have to be just as causally inert or causally inefficacious as bodies. Because God's the one who's preserving them in their existence with their particular modal properties, with their particular ideas. So God must be, it would seem, the principal and efficient cause. Okay? He wants to say that minds are causally active, because he wants to say that we are really responsible, willing agents. Right? Volition belongs to us in an important sense. And he can't really do that. Okay? Now, the next figure I'll just mention briefly is Spinoza, because Nazif asked me to talk about Spinoza and Malebranche for the conference on Saturday and Sunday. So I'll spend more time then talking about Spinoza. But for Spinoza, the important thing, I'll get to Proposition 16 in a moment, but we know Spinoza's a monist. There's only one substance. That substance is God or nature. All things that we would normally think of as being finite beings are simply modes of that one being. Thought and extension are attributes of that one being, and we perceive or we conceive of individuals, finite things, now under the attribute of extension, now under the attribute of thought, and so on. That's standard kind of Spinoza stigmatism. There's nothing surprising in that. Well, that's in itself amazing and surprising, but that's something I'm sure you all know. And again, I'll talk more about that, the monism per se, on Saturday. But I want to limit my discussion of Spinoza just to his causal theory. And the most important thing for Spinoza here is just the thesis that comes out of Proposition 16 of Part 1 of the Ethics, which is his claim, from the necessity of the divine nature there must follow infinitely many things in infinitely many modes, or in infinitely many ways. That is, everything which can fall under an infinite intellect. Okay? Now, two things that are, well, a couple things that are important here, one of which I'll talk a lot more about on Saturday. Note that things follow from God's nature, not his will. All right? This is going to be the crucial difference with Malebranche, of course. Things follow from God's nature. The first corollary to Proposition 16 is, however, something that would seem, on the surface of it, broadly occasionalistic, in that he says that God is the efficient cause of all things. And also in corollaries 2 and 3, the claim is that God is the immediate and free cause of all things. All right? Now, add to that the idea that we, you and I, as modes of God, right, simply are acting in a deterministic way, a way following from God's nature, it would seem that we are not causally efficacious either in some important sense, right? So it might seem that there's a kind of occasionalist theory there. Or the other way around, again, which is the question Nazif asked me to address, is whether Malebranche's occasionalism really collapses to a kind of Spinozism, right? Maybe there's not this big distinction between Spinozistic monism and occasionalism. I'll talk about that Saturday. So what I want to do now is just, as I said, that's just 2 seconds on Spinoza, who's tremendously important, tremendously interesting, obviously. But I want to go to the lesser-known figure, Gödeling's, who has what I consider a really interesting, but also, truth be told, crazy and stupid theory. He says in the Metaphysica Vera, he says there's a certain fundamental causal principle, right? He reduces everything to this causal principle. It's impossible for someone to bring about something if they do not know how it is to be brought about. You are not the cause of that which you do not know how to do. That's his Latin, which is kind of awkward. The shorter version of it in Latin is just, what you don't know how to make, you don't make. Right? What you don't know how to do, you don't do. You can't. All right? Now, he says, this is what causation ultimately reduces to. You have to understand how to produce the effect in order to produce the effect. All right? And so he will say, you or your mind, you don't know how to make the sensation of warmth when you're standing by the fire. Sure, you feel warm, but you don't know how to create that sensation within you, right? Therefore, the mind, your mind, is not causally efficacious. The mind does not produce ideas. Similarly, I don't know how it is that I go from my volition, Brandon, lift the water bottle to make an example. I don't know how that goes from my ideas out into my hand and here. So that is my mind, I can't be the cause of that, right? So much for the Gödeling's. And in a similar way, the fire is an unthinking thing. And so it cannot be responsible for the production of your sensations. The fire doesn't know how to produce an idea in me, so it can't be the cause, right? The conclusion is kind of obvious at this point. Only a thinking and willing agent can bring about such effects. This agent must know how to produce all the different ideas in human minds, and that's got to be a pretty smart agent. And that pretty smart agent is God, right? Similarly, only a thinking and willing agent can bring about all the effects in the realm of nature, the phenomena of the actions of bodies, that is. No body can ever be such a causal agent, and this can only be God. Right? Again, with all due respect to Gödeling's, and there are other cool and interesting things in Gödeling's, but this particular argument, the philosophical term is stupid. Sorry. Unconvincing. But there's a way in which, as I said, I don't like the term rationalism so much when it's applied, or when it's just given a blanket general term for grouping together a whole bunch of people. But you see here a way in which rationalism kind of makes sense in that the entire world is rationally ordered. It's rationally governed. There's a connection, a close connection, supposedly, between God as a mind and God as a willing agent and God as a rational creature, and then the actions of all things in the world, right? So that's a way in which the rational nature of God and His omnipotence, omniscience, and will correlate to a rational order of the world. Something that you do see, and that is something that brings together Leibniz and Spinoza and Descartes in an important way, in a meaningful way. All right, now finally to, I think I'm going to be done a little bit early. Getting to Malebranche, the main, okay. So, Malebranche. Malebranche has many different arguments for occasionalism. I want to present two here, usually the ones that are most discussed in Anglo-American literature, because arguably they're the most important and most central. The first is usually called the no causal connection argument. Malebranche says in the search after truth, and this is one of those places where you do have one of these figures saying very clearly, this is what a cause is. Okay? A true cause, as I understand it, is one such that the mind perceives a necessary connection between it and its effect. Now, the mind perceives a necessary connection only between the will of an infinitely perfect being and its effects. Therefore, it is only God who is the true cause and who truly has the power to move bodies. All right? So let me just give a rephrased version of this to make it a little more global or universal. An event is a true cause if and only if there is a necessary connection between it and its effect. There are necessary connections only between the will of an infinite, perfect being and its effects, and therefore the only true cause is the infinitely perfect being, God. Okay? Now, the first part of this, or premise one, as you will, is the premise that basically lights the ears on fire of anybody who's read Hume first, right? Because you have the idea here that a cause has to be a necessary connection, right? A true cause, implies a necessary connection between a cause, between event A and event B, right? And of course, Hume will come along and say, well, we can never perceive that connection. We perceive one thing and we perceive another thing. We can never have an impression of a necessary connection. And so we don't know this. But what's thing is simply what a cause is this necessary connection between it and an effect. So if we have event E or event A, it can only be a cause of event B if whenever A happens, B must happen. All the time, in all possible worlds. Anywhere, anytime. Okay? But, Malebranche suggests, the only thing that really has that power to do this all the time, connect A and B, all the time, everywhere, every when, everywhere, every when, in every possible world, and Malebranche too has a theory of possible worlds, that's God, okay? And so, the reason I rephrase this in part is the quote at least applies only to bodies, but of course it applies to minds as well. And the connection of, or the flow of ideas in a mind. And as I said before, with respect to Laforge, it seemed as though, on his view of causation and of divine conservation, minds have to be causally inert. But he wanted them to be causally efficacious. Malebranche actually bites the bullet and just says, the mind is also causally inefficacious in a certain way, because our ideas simply are part of the divine intellect. That's a whole different discussion, but I'll just throw it out there. Okay, so that's the one really crucial argument that we get in Malebranche. The second crucial argument relates to divine conservation and creation and volition, often called conservation is but continuous creation. That's the way Lee and Steve Nadler and others, Occasionalists, refer to it. But here's one of the nicest texts from Boğaziçi that gets at this. So the instant of creation is past. Be careful of what you say. God wills that there be a world. His will is all-powerful, and so the world is made. Let God no longer will that there be a world, and it is thereby annihilated. For the world certainly depends on the volitions of the Creator. If the world subsists, it is because God continues to will that the world exist. On the part of God, the conservation of creatures is simply their continued creation. I say, on the part of God, who acts. For, from the perspective of creatures, there appears to be a difference, since in creation they pass from nothing to being, whereas in conservation they continue to be, and now my emphasis, but in reality, creation does not pass away because in God, conservation and creation are one and the same volition, which consequently is necessarily followed by the same effects. All right? Now, one thing to note here, Descartes, even though he claims that conservation is but continuous recreation, also makes very explicit that the laws of motion, for example, are dependent upon the nature of God. God as an immutable, that is, unchanging being. And if you were to just look at this passage, talking about taking things out of context, but if you were to just look at this passage, it might seem as though Malebranche is saying, well, God creates the world, and he could decide a little bit later to just let everything go out of existence. Why not? But he continues to want the world to keep chugging along and doing its thing, and so therefore his continued active volition is necessary to preserve the world at each moment in a certain way. Okay? Descartes has the doctrine of conservation as continuous creation, but if you just say God created everything in the beginning, God's immutable, you don't have to necessarily, I guess, think that God could be so arbitrary as to let everything fall out of existence. I mean, in another sense, God is very arbitrary for Descartes as well. We know this. But in any case, this is one of the standard Malebranchian arguments. I'll talk about a couple more on Saturday, I think. The thing to notice, though, about this argument and about the preceding argument is that they are, as Nadler and Lee describe it, these are global in import. Okay, they apply to all things, and it's not just body-body interaction. It's not just correlation of ideas in the mind. It's all causal interaction can be reduced to these two facets of the nature of God. Okay. Finally, Leibniz. And also, just to be brief, to be very brief. I said that if rationalism means anything, it means a commitment to the idea that there are innate ideas and a commitment to the principle of sufficient reason. But we also know that even though Descartes and Spinoza and Malebranche and these other figures believed that there was nothing without a cause, it was Leibniz who first formulated the principle of sufficient reason in a particular way and gave it pride of place. Right? He emphasized it in a way that these other figures really didn't. And so this is just one of 1,000 kinds of examples of this, where Leibniz says, this axiom, that there's nothing without a reason, quod nihil est sine ratione, that there's nothing without a reason, must be considered one of the greatest and most fruitful of all human knowledge. For upon it is built a great part of metaphysics, physics, and moral science. So here you've got a kind of causal thesis. There's nothing without a reason, right? A universal causal maxim. Everything has a ground, has a reason for its existence. Everything, every event has a, or every effect has a cause, all right? And he says this is the foundation for a great part of metaphysics, physics, and moral science. Well, what are the kinds of things that follow from this for Leibniz? You know, these should be obvious for anybody who's taken a course in the history of modern philosophy, but just rehearse these. They are the following, among others. For Leibniz, we've got the complete concept theory of substance, which says that every substance, or sorry, a substance is so complete that it contains within it reasons for why it is so, not otherwise. The concept of every substance is so complete that it contains propositions relating to all truths about it, past, present, and future. Everything can be read out of the complete individual concept of the substance. Tied in with that, though, you know, in one sense, the PSR follows from Leibniz's very distinctive account of truth, which is another story, but we'll just start with the principle of sufficient reason. The complete concept theory of substance follows from that. In a way, what follows from that is a denial of causal interaction. Okay? So, considered in metaphysical rigor, there is no causal interaction among substances. Right? Every substance is in itself causally efficacious. That is, each substance is causally responsible for the production of new ideas, of new volitions, of new perceptions. Each substance goes from perception 1 to perception 2 to perception 3, from volition 1 to volition 2 to volition 3, and so on. But that comes from its own stores, as Leibniz will put it, right? And since there's no causal interaction, there can't be any interaction of mind and body. Now, forget the fact that in one sense there aren't bodies considered in the Cartesian sense for Leibniz, but we'll just leave that. So therefore, we're left to pre-establish harmony, right? So, whereas Descartes gave us this problem, again, this is the standard, very survey account, where Descartes gave us this problem of how do you explain the relation of mind and body, how do you explain their union, how can it be the case that the mind can produce actions in a body, how can it be that the body produces sensations in the mind when they're of a fundamentally different nature? We get a certain kind of thesis among Malebranche, say, that God is causally responsible for each idea and for each motion. We get the idea in Spinoza that God just rolls out his nature, and we conceive of finite beings now under one aspect, or under one attribute, now under the other attribute. We get in Leibniz the idea that the mind and the body are each moving along in harmony. And there is no true interaction. Okay? So that's one way in which he just avoids that complete problem. The other thing that follows from the principle of sufficient reason for Leibniz, and this is something I won't go into, but in a way it's the monadology. That is, that strictly speaking, the only kinds of substances that exist are mind-like beings that are analogous to forms, okay, or substances that are analogous to mind, I guess you could put it that way. Right? So that's why I said, you know, in one sense, he'll say that there's pretty established harmony between mind and body. That's when he's speaking to the Cartesians, when he wants to give you an answer to the mind-body problem as Descartes gave it to us. Well, there's the body and there's the mind, and they've got their separate realms, and they're moving along in a certain way. The more sophisticated answer is, well, you know, the body conceived of as Descartes conceived it doesn't really exist It's just a result of innumerable mind-like monads, each of which is cruising along in its own way. Well, let's go back and just talk about pre-established harmony. The argument you get in the new system of nature is pretty simple and pretty spiffy. He writes, speaking with metaphysical rigor, there's no real influence of one created substance on another. That's just the denial of causal interaction. God originally created the soul in such a way that everything must arise for it from its own depths, from its own stores, through a perfect spontaneity relative to itself, and yet with perfect conformity relative to external things. Right? That's kind of the doctrine of the complete concept theory of substance. I mean, everything is within a substance from the beginning, and everything arises from a spontaneity within itself. Right? That's how we go from one idea to another, from one perception to another, from one volition to another. And it's the mutual relation regulated in advance in each substance of the universe, which produces what we call their communication, and which alone brings about the union of soul and body. Okay? Again, this is for speaking to and for the Cartesians, but it's a way of saying occasionalism is the least likely theory, or at least it's not as likely as my theory. He doesn't say flat out, it's false, but he will say here, my theory of the pre-established harmony of mind and body is the most likely. And then you've got the famous comparison that ultimately, actually, I think Gerlings first came up with, of two clocks. Right? Okay, this is in the new system of nature. You've got two clocks, two pendulum clocks, suspended by a beam, right? And you can say, well, how do you explain their coordination, their regularity with each other? You can say that the motion of the one somehow transmits motion by virtue of through the beam to the other, and they kind of cruise along together. That's something like maybe what he wants to attribute to Descartes. Or you can say, this is very clear in the analogy that he draws, or you can say that God is moving each pendulum at each moment, right? And that's the theory of occasional causes. Or you can say, as Leibniz do, that God just set everything up so perfectly that they're just in harmony, right? And so that's the way he resolves this tension, this supposed tension. So that's the end of the story for the rationalists that I want to tell. I've covered a lot of ground very quickly, but I think I will just stop there.
We have about 20 minutes for questions, so let's keep questions short. And I saw your hand first.
Thanks a lot. About the allegedly stupid argument by I think everyone here of Gerling's work.
Yeah.
Maybe it's a stupid argument. But it's a stupid argument. It's also from Malebranche.
That's true. No, absolutely. I forgot to mention that.
In relation to possibility of mind-body causation in case of moving your own body. I don't know how my hand works, or I don't know how my body works, so I don't know how to raise my hand.
Right.
I don't know anything about this. But still, I suppose one way to make it perhaps less stupid is to think of the idea that there's a prominent idea that to give a definition for something, to understand first things of knowledge, first truths. The best way to understand is to be able to know how to give it. And that's sort of a prominent tradition, the maker's knowledge tradition. I mean, Spinoza is a good example, but Hobbes is perhaps even better example. That knowing how do you know the first definitions? How do you know the sort of Euclidean definitions, for instance?
Right.
Well, you know them. What is a line? Well, you know what a line is because you can make a line by mechanically moving points. to a direction. You get a, you know what a surface is because you can move the line within a surface, so you get an area, and so on. So I suppose I'm wondering, maybe it's a stupid argument, but maybe there's some background for it within that Baker's institution, which was really prominent.
No, I think you're totally right. And I forgot to mention that Boğaziçi uses this kind of argument too. Yeah, I should know better than to just throw off that's a stupid argument in the talk. But what I find unsatisfactory is the following. I will concede to you everything that you said, that there's a certain tradition in which, in order to understand something, in order to have true knowledge of something, you have to understand the cause, and that also means understanding how to produce something. And you can see this, going later in Kant, where you have this idea of the axioms of, or mathematical propositions have a certain feature because they are constructed, right? We construct the objects of mathematics, and so we know them in a certain way, okay? Even in Leibniz's knowledge on meditations on knowledge, truth, and ideas, you have a similar kind of thing that it's very important to know how we produce things. That's part of what it means to know something at all. And yeah, here's what I find unsatisfactory. It seems to me that by giving this kind of causal principle, it's just completely begging the question. It's just completely setting up the account of causation so you get the result you want. Because I don't see why we would ever want to think that causation must necessarily have an epistemological component to it. Why should, if causation is simply the relation between events over time, and however you want to put it, some way, a transfer of effects, of properties from one thing to another, or whatever, it wouldn't seem to me that the only way in which you need to understand the relation between cause C and effect P is that the causal agent must know how to produce it. Because you've already ruled out that there can be any causation among inanimate beings, of unthinking beings, right? Yeah.
I think the argument doesn't try to explicate the relation of causation.
Mm-hmm.
It supposes that there is a relation of causation and tries to identify who is the cause.
Right.
It doesn't give us an idea about what is causation. Just to suppose that there is a kind of causation, but it tries to identify who is the cause.
Right, but you've already, by using this as if this is the fundamental causal principle, then you've already begged the question. You've already given, you've set it up so you've got the conclusion you want.
Maybe in the wrong way. I don't know. It might not be the fundamental causal principle, but it might be a necessary condition to identify a certain causal agent once we have an idea of causation at the background.
Well, I'm willing to concede that that there are all sorts of cases of cause and effect where the cause is knowledgeable of how to produce the effect. I'm just not willing to concede that every cause is such that it must know how to produce the effect.
Yeah, thank you very much for this nice presentation. My question is going to be about the curve.
Mm-hmm.
I'm not sure it's proper question to ask in this case, but I'm just wondering. You said that one of the reasons why the curve, Occasionalism,
Why do you use that? Because I think some people can't hear you well.
he thought time is discrete,
Right.
right?
Yeah.
But on the other hand, you know that with his discussion with Gassendi,
Mm-hmm.
he strongly disagreed with atomism. He said that extensions are discontinuous.
Right.
But on the other hand, you know that Aristotle, including Occasionalism theologian, they said that space, time, extensions, movements, changes are same in existentially same. If space is continuous, time must be continuous as well. If time is discontinuous, space, matter, energy, everything must be discontinuous as well. Why, how did Picard on one hand defend that time is discrete, discontinuous, on the other hand, extensions and another thing in the universe is continuous?
No,
How do you explain this?
that's a great question. So there are two things to be said there. First of all, Descartes' argument against Gassendi or any kind of atomism is that the nature of body is extension. That is, it's just to be extended in space, and for any body, you can cut it up further. So there are no ultimate atoms. Okay, so you're right. Completely, he's committed to the doctrine that there's continuity in the material world. Now, one might say, but wait a second, that's not making a claim about space, and it's space and time that are the ones that should have common features. The response to that is what you're getting for, ultimately. So that would be one response, but it would be the wrong response, because for Descartes, there's ultimately not going to be a distinction between space and body, because space, or the universe, is a plenum, and there's no actual conceptual, not much of a conceptual distinction between space and body. So all that's to say is, good question. You might say this, that would be wrong. So now I'm back to answering the question. I don't know. Maybe Jeff just does, because it's hand going up in a second. Descartes says all these things about, at this moment, and you might, there's a tradition, let me just put it this way, there's a tradition in scholarship of treating Descartes as being something like a temporal atomist, okay? So I was just playing into that, because I wanted to make the connection to the point that Hume will make later, okay? I actually don't have a strong commitment either way. Jeff, can you help me?
I suspect it doesn't turn on temporal atomism at all.
Yeah.
Suppose it's a continuous line. I think all his argument's going to need is that any point, think of that as a cut rather than as an atom. Doesn't depend on any other point, even if it's a continuous line. I think that's all his argument needs. It's sort of natural to put that thought in terms of a temporal atomism. Brandon's, of course, right, that's what people usually think about that. My guess is nothing's going to turn on whether the temporal dimension is actually discrete or continuous.
Yes.
I think the resolution, the same point, the resolution of this problem could be that Descartes understood space as a continuous and the body continuous, whereas time being past, future, and present moment, and the moment is moving. The moment was atomized. So in the background of their thinking, that time is composed of moments.
Mm-hmm.
And therefore points. This stems of this thing from the classical understanding and perception that classical agreement that space and time are completely independent and absolute.
Right.
Yes.
Yeah, I'm sorry, I arrived a bit late, so I might have missed this bit. But with regard to the premise that bodies have no properties in and of themselves other than corporeity or extension, and therefore are causally inefficacious, what's the basis of this premise? How is it?
This
What's
is,
Causal?
yeah, I mean, this is the way that Descartes conceives of the nature of body. He just says it's of the nature of body to be extended, and that's it. I mean, it's tied up, though, with the rejection of Aristotelian causation, so that you don't have in body anything like a formal component, formal cause, or material cause separate from extension. Okay, and so, you know, what's it based on? It's based on Descartes' attempt to mechanize the world, to describe it in terms of matter and motion, and also, insofar as one is to think of bodies as merely being geometrical objects, to mathematize the natural world. And so we're going to start with thinking of bodies purely as extended, as occupying space in 3 dimensions, as being in motion. All of these things we can describe mathematically. And so we're giving up things which Leibniz will want to bring back in. I didn't talk about this, but Leibniz will want to bring back in, like forces, inherent forces in things. Right?
I think
Dynamism.
my question is, it should have been more clearer. But isn't there a theological motive for this premise? In which case, I mean, the argumentation would be circular. You know, bodies don't have properties, causal properties, because we want God to have all these, we want to, attribute all causation to God, and therefore, all this. In which case, all the arguments that they provide to establish that God is responsible for causation would be circular.
Yeah. Yes and no. Let me start with the last figure I mentioned, Leibniz. So, on one kind of interpretation of Leibniz, in which you make him very Platonic, right? You will say that there is God, and all of the monads are expressing all of the universe from unique points of view, and ultimately there's no real matter, real body kind of stuff. They're just, expressive subjects, substances, okay? And God is, even though each individual monad will be an expressive substance, or representative substance, and it will have a series of ideas, volitions, sensations in and of itself or from its own source. In another sense, that's also kind is a very Platonic reading, but kind of flowing from God, and so on. So that's the end figure of this little story. In the case of Descartes, so go back to the beginning part of the story, is there a theological component of it? Not as much. I mean, the theological component is, if anything, less. It's more sociological than philosophical. By which I mean, he wants to reject the standard scholastic account of the natural world as taught in the schools because he finds it ineffective and not helpful in arriving at new knowledge, and all those guys have been stuck doing all this scholastic stuff and they don't know anything, and so whatever. So I'm going to have this different conception, and so on and so forth. So that's kind of like the first part of the story.
So I would to nominate another argument besides this one for the stupid argument.
Okay.
This one doesn't seem that. I think you might have already expressed this, but possibly not. But you did, excuse me for that. It seems like here it's not necessarily playing with the causal principle. You're saying it is impossible for someone to bring about something. So it's someone, it's not me. If, as we were to assume maybe someone is a mind, then we're talking about a mind, right? So it's not as if we're talking about because of the nature of cause as such, the cause must know everything about its effect. What we're saying is that if the mind is the cause, then the cause must know about its effect. So it's about the nature of the causal body being the mind. not the nature of causation itself.
Yeah.
For example, if someone were to say, if a fire is the cause of something, it must transfer to the effect, right? And we would say that if the fire is the cause, the fire therefore couldn't be the cause of my understanding of the argument, right? Because fire is not the kind of thing that can do that because of the nature of fire. So if the mind is to be the cause, then, right, the someone who is the mind, being the cause of the effect, must know, right, all about the effect. This one suggestion about how that's better. But just the other argument that I thought was
okay.
is maybe, but it's the one from Continental. He said if a first mover has a body, then the body would have motion per se.
Yeah.
This seems to entail the implicit premise that the first mover has motion per se. And I would have thought that the first mover was unmoved, so he wouldn't have motion per se. He would be giving motion, but not be moved himself. And then I realized that we actually have three different possibilities. We have the idea of being moved, moving, and giving motion to others.
Yeah.
My understanding of the unmoved mover was one who neither is moved by something else nor is moving at all.
Yeah.
Not changing. So I would think that Kurimoy wouldn't think that the unmoved mover wouldn't have motion.
That's a great point. Yeah.
So maybe time for one or two more questions. I see one hand. Any others? Okay, three short questions. Okay.
And just to continue with that, about the stupidity of the argument, stupidity of possibly strict argument. If you start with the idea that bodies are falsely lined up, as Descartes does, then you're not really starting with the idea that cause is a relation between temporarily extended events. You don't have event causation and cause and effect. Rather, you seem to be thinking of causality as something to do with powers somehow.
Yeah.
And saying that there are no powers in bodies.
Right.
And in that case, the natural idea thing is where do we find powers? I find powers in myself. So the paradigm case for causation is intentional action. In which case, it's not altogether stupid to think that I somehow have to know how to bring it about.
Yeah.
Although it's not obvious either.
No, thank you. Because again, that's a point I should have made, that for Kurlings and Malebranche and many of these other figures, they do say explicitly the paradigm, I know what a cause is because I know what it means to do stuff. Okay, but just think about that. I mean, I know that causes exist because I know that I can raise this bottle. That's different from saying I can raise this bottle only because I understand how I get from this volition in here, in this mind, whatever, to the animal spirits in the brain, and they go down through the arm. I don't know how that works. And so that's the tricky. But yeah, but volition is the paradigmatic case of causation, and intentionality, some kind of rationality, seems to go along with that. But then to make it because it has to be all these things. It's too strong.
Do any of these theories have empirical consequences?
Define empirical consequence?
Does it put any kind of constraint on the kind of things we could find if we went out in the world and started pushing and pulling stuff?
Sure. So if you look at Descartes' laws of motion, which is the first one is inertia, the second one is equilibrium motion, the third one has to deal with the ways in which bodies of different sizes impact each other. And then there are a bunch of little laws of impact, things like that. And if you look at that, Descartes has this long discussion of how, a body of this kind of size moving at this speed that impacts a body of this size can move it in this way or whatever. But part of it, so there's an empirical consequence that you can go out and test, and of course, guess what? Descartes is totally wrong about all of this stuff because he doesn't factor in mass, factor in things that will lead to forces, or even it's not even clear that vector motion is going to be relevant and things like that. So there are empirical consequences that are kind of obvious and then rather funny that they're obviously wrong.
Okay, yeah, I guess I was just focused on like thinking about the nature of causation because that sounds like that's just
Oh,
in addition to what causation is, there's some physics in that.
yeah.
I don't want to.
Yes, last question.
So based on what Descartes said, you talked about two types of causation, body-body causation and mind-body causation. So while you were talking about those two types of causation, I was expecting to hear another type of causation, maybe mind-mind causation.
Okay.
So I was thinking about, so okay, we have two entities here, body and mind. So you also have God for Descartes, but for the time being, that's for your mind. So when we talk about body and mind, okay, we can clearly see the problem about body-body causation and mind-body causation. But there is also interesting cases related to what we can call mind-mind causation. So I'm listening to you, you're presenting your beliefs or your views about certain things, which we can call those beliefs mental contents.
Right.
So they are related, they pertain to your mind. So when you utter those, when you express your beliefs or opinions about certain things, then I form my own opinions or beliefs, which we can call again mental contents. So they also pertain to the mind.
Yeah.
So it seems to me that there is also a causal connection between minds. So one can also talk about mind-mind causation. Do you think that that type of causation is important for those philosophers, or do they reduce this problem to those two types of causation?
Well, in one sense, it's obviously important, but it's also the case, just as you said again, they reduce it to the one thing. That is, you say, you're sitting here, you're listening to me, and I've got ideas, and then you have ideas. But of course, that's all mediated by my speech, right? So, blah, 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 and it goes out, and you get it in the ears, and then it translates somehow into ideas, right? So it's always going to be mediated in that way, unless we're going to, say that somehow I can produce ideas in you by force of will.
But can't you say the same thing about relationship between mind and body? It is also mediated by physical.
Well, yeah, and this is the great embarrassment of Cartesian philosophy.
But you can also reduce the problem about mind and body into a problem about body-body causation. Right?
The embarrassing thing in Cartesian philosophy is how exactly one explains this relation between mind and body, because then you've got this account of, well, the mind has these ideas, and then there's this pineal gland at the center of the brain, and that kind of vibrates in a certain way because of certain ideas, and then that sends out the animal spirits and whatever. It's not a very happy doctrine.
Maybe we can resolve these questions in the next 10 or 15 minutes during coffee time, but thank you very much.